Okay, I'm going to cover ambient occlusion plus textures in this video. And the reason for that is if you want your ball to have a certain look, like if I wanted this to look like a beach ball or baseball or whatever, then I could texture it like that and then just pipe this texture in with the ambient occlusion texture, and that way this thing will retain its look. I can still follow the rotations of the ball because of the texture. Okay, so what I want to do is grab the objects I want to be part of the ambient occlusion texture render and just come over in the render layer and click this button, which will create a new layer and assign the objects that are selected to that layer. I want to go ahead and give that some sort of name that makes sense. So maybe AO plus T, if you can remember what that might mean, ambient occlusion plus texture. You can give it any kind of name you want though. We're not going to assign a preset here, we're just going to set up the shaders manually. So I'm going to go to Window, Rendering Editors, Hypershade, and in here I want to use a special type of shader called a surface shader. A surface shader doesn't care about lighting, and I'm just going to clear this out so I only have this in my working area. All it cares about is the incoming color or texture that you give it. So for point of demonstration, I will pipe in this ramp texture, which I'm using to make the beach ball look like a beach ball, and I'll choose default. So that was a middle click drag, and that will take the out color of the texture and put it into the out color of the surface shader. So I need to assign that to the ball. So I'll just select that, right click and drag up, and then do a quick render here. And you can see that it's basically looks just like as if it had been applied to an incandescence channel of like a Lambert or a Blinn or something like that. Okay, so that's a start. We now have the texture on there and sort of indifferent of whatever lighting is happening in the scene. So in order to get the ambient occlusion, that's a mental ray texture. So I'll go to mental ray textures, and then it's just this guy right here, MIB Amb Occlusion. You can filter for it here if you're not sure where it is. You just have to sort of know part of what it's called. So I'll click this guy, just sort of put him over here, and we have to figure out what to do with it now. So I want these two things to be composited together, and the easiest way to do that in Maya, I want them to sort of stack like this if this was Photoshop, with this being multiplied on top of this. That way I get wherever it's white and there's nothing around the object, it will look just like whatever the texture is, and wherever it's black, it will just darken down this texture or black it out if it's actually full black. So what I want to do here is create a layered texture. So in Maya, that's a Maya other textures because it can take in a 2D or a 3D texture as part of the input. So it's layered texture here. And middle click on the ambient occlusion and release onto the layered texture and choose input color 0, and then middle click from the ramp and release and choose input color 1. And that just sets up my stacking order, so now I have ambient occlusion on top and then the ramp. If you didn't do that in the correct order, it's just middle click and drag here. So in Maya, the left is the topmost, as opposed to like Photoshop or something where it's the top to bottom, it's left to right here. So all I need to do is make sure ambient occlusion texture is selected and highlight here and change its blend mode to multiply. So now that will multiply over here. And then I'll middle click, drag the layered texture onto the surface color, and again choose default, and that will just override this previous input and pipe this guy in. And despite the fact that this looks pure black, it actually will work properly. It's just the fact that this is a dynamic generated texture, so Maya doesn't really know what to do with it in terms of the sample. So I'll minimize this and do a render just to show you what happens. This actually won't work because we're rendering with Maya software. MIB is a mental ray node, so you have to make sure your render is set to mental ray. So I'll set that back to mental ray, press render again, and there you go. So now it is being considered as part of the render calculation. You can actually see instead of being just pure colors, these now in a very crusty way have some shading on them. We have a really poor preset on this right now, and also the the ambient occlusion node needs a little bit of tuning as well. So let's just make a couple of quick changes so we can see what we're doing. Pop open my render settings. In quality, I'll just use one of the quality presets to get me to the right place here. So maybe I'll just use previews, probably acceptable. Well, let me just try production and see what this does to our render time. So I'll just click that. We were previously rendering in about 1 second. Now it's 2 seconds and a really nice clean render. And I could go ahead and tune up that ambient occlusion, but I can't quite tell. It does look gritty, but I'll be able to tell more when I see it down here on the ground plane. So I'm going to finish the shader setup, and we'll come back and tune out the ambient occlusion. So once again, back to the hypershade. And for everything else that you don't want a texture on, all you have to do is add a surface shader and just pipe this ambient occlusion texture directly into that. So I'll just choose default here. And it might be a good idea to start giving these things names. So I'll call this ball mat or something, whatever you want to call it. And surface shader 3, so I'll just call this AO mat, something like that. So you don't want to use a bunch of different ambient occlusion texture nodes unless you want different settings for different objects, but in this case I want them to all be considered the same. I want them to have the same smoothness, the same fall off, and all that kind of business. So I'll just use one texture and pipe that to 2 different places. So then I'll come over here, I'll select the ground plane, and then I'll right click and drag up to assign that. So now we should basically have the render that is working aside from the background. So now you can see we have the ambient occlusion shading happening on the ground plane, and if this was on a white background, it would actually look pretty close to what we're going for here. So let's just make that change. That is from whatever camera you're going to be rendering from. You go to the view panel for it, and then just camera attribute editor. Alternatively, you could pick your camera from your outliner and just go to the attribute editor there, however you want to do it. And I'll scroll down here until I get to an environment section, open this guy up, and just push the background color up to white, and then do another render and see what we have. Okay, so it's looking pretty good. I need to tune up the ambient occlusion texture node just a little bit. It's very gritty right now, so let's do that. Once again, back to the hypershade for the last time of this video, I think. And I'll go to textures and double click on the ambient occlusion node. Only thing I'm interested in right now is the samples, so I'll just push the samples up to maybe 64. You don't have to say power of 2, I just do it out of old habit. And I'll try another render here. And this will increase our render time, but it will look substantially better. It's still a 4-second render to get a reasonable quality render happening here. So I'm pretty pleased with that. I think it looks fine. So that's it for this one. I'll go over the rest of the render settings in a common movie. So whichever one of these methods you use, just regular ambient occlusion or ambient occlusion plus texture, you can follow that up with the common movie.